We're the foundational Black American history. In this series, we're talking about foundational Black American history, and it's meant to be a series that can help you to understand our great history of the foundational Black Americans. This historical discussion will help you explore and understand where foundational Black Americans came from and our roots. This is a video is about foundational Black Americans. I'm Dr. Clyde Winters, and I'm going to teach you about the roots of foundational Black American history. You know, we are here to learn our history, so stay tuned. I've written many books on foundational Black American history. Some of the books that can help you to understand where I'm coming from include The History of Blacks in America from Prehistory to 1877. In this book, I provide an overall view of the foundations of foundational Black American history. In this book, I explain that foundational Black Americans have a tripartite origin. Although we've been taught that basically that our whole entire origin was in Africa, that's false. In reality, foundational Black Americans have a tripartite origin. In other words, our ancestors include the Black Native Americans, Black Europeans, and naturally people from Africa. But all of us didn't necessarily come from Africa. And this has to be understood to really know and understand foundational Black American history. In my other book, The Phylogeography of Afro-Americans and Africans, in this book I talk about the DNA. I explain the various haplogroups that Black people carry and the fact in a sense that just about every haplogroup that's carried by anybody on the planet Earth originated in Africa. It originated in Africa among African people. And it was from Africa that Black people began to spread across the various continents. And that's one of the reasons why all the continents are, in a sense, inhabited by Blacks, but the original home of these Blacks was Africa. And then finally, my book, We Are Not Just Africans. This is a very important book. This book is important because it's the first book that explains that many foundational Black Americans have a Black Indian heritage. Yes, for example, I have Choctaw in addition to my African heritage. And so if you get the book, We Are Not Just Africans, you're going to find out about the relationship between Black people. Find out, in a sense, how many people who, in a sense, were the first slaves in the United States were not Africans. The first slaves in the United States, chattel slaves, were Black Indians, you see. And so this book, in a sense, explains it. It tells you that our origins are not just in Africa, that our origins are from here, too. So We Are Not Just Africans. Also, some other books include Atlantis in Mexico, African Empires in Ancient America, and Ancient Scripts in South America. These books, in a sense, will give you a very good understanding of the experiences of Black people in pre-Columbian America. You get my book, The Mandy in Ancient America, you're going to find out about the various Mandy groups. Yes, Mandy groups that, in a sense, were tribes. There were about 10 or 20 tribes in North America that declared that their names were Mandy, or they spoke Mandy languages. And then my book, The Black Mound Builders of America. In this book, you're going to find out that many of the mounds built in the United States were built by foundational Black Americans, and that these mounds sometimes even show that they are identical to the mounds that we find in West Africa. So get that book too. During the Atlantic slave trade, an estimated 60 million Blacks were taken to the Americas from Africa. Professor Curtin in the Atlantic Slave Trade, a census, has estimated that over 10 million Africans were sold into slavery. But this estimate has been shown by several scholars writing the Journal of African History and elsewhere as being far too low. Yes, far too low. Slavery has always been a part of the lifestyle of ancient Africans and Europeans. But it was not the same type of slavery practiced by Africans and Europeans after the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. It must be remembered that the Atlantic slave trade was an event in world history involving three continents, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The people who set out to seek slaves were Europeans coming from every country between Sweden in the north and Portugal in the south. It must not be forgotten that Africans were packed like sardines on the slave ships and consequently died in great numbers. All of us must also remember that Africans actively participated in the slave trade, yes, and without their help, the trade would never have provided the vast profits made by European countries which financed their development. In Africa, the slave was a stranger to the community where he was held. In most cases, he had his own land. He was responsible for giving part of his crop to his master. Though Africans held slaves, we must remember that they were not chattel slaves. They were still treated as human beings. The slaves sold in the New World came from all over Africa. The movement of the slaving area changed over the centuries from the northwest section of the continent in the 1450s to East Africa in the 1800s. The earliest slaves came from the Mandan Wolof areas behind the Guinea coast. Susu from Guinea were called Shosho. Other slaves in the 1450s to 1500s were Wolof from Senegal and Tuareg from Mauritania. Some slaves came from Nigeria, such as the Nupe, called Tapas in the Americas. Later, the Yorubas were sold into slavery by the Fon people of Benin. They were called Nagas, or Nagos. A slave had few rights, if any. A slave was considered chattel property. Chattel property is what? Chattel property is an article of personal property, yes. Yes, foundational Black Americans were considered chattel property by their masters. As a result, slaves' rights were usually associated with the laws for animal protection, unless the state constitution specifically recognized slaves as citizens, which most constitutions didn't. Most Blacks in the United States of America are called Afro-Americans. Today we call them foundational Black Americans. We call them foundational Black Americans because FBA, Foundational Black Americans, is a lineage. Yes, a lineage. We see ourselves as the lineage, and that we have, in a sense, an African ancestry, you see, but our heritages can be from many, many different groups. Although many FBA are descendants of slaves, the Black population of the United States is derived from Black Europeans and Black Native Americans, in addition to Africans. Black Native Americans were already in the United States when Europeans found the American continent. These Blacks lived from the east coast of the United States all the way down to Florida. They also lived in the Midwest, South, and Southwest, and on the Pacific shore from California to the state of Florida. The Black Native Americans all belonged to the Cree, Creek, Ojibwa, Chippewa, Seminoles, Cherokee, Dogere, Papago, Delaware, Huron, Iroquois nations. In Florida, they built many forts made of red brick and fought the United States Army for many, many years. The first Blacks to come to the United States were Europeans as slaves. These Blacks came from Europe. The Black Europeans were the descendants of the Moors who ruled much of Europe up to 1492. When Black Muslims were pushed out of Spain or Portugal back into Africa, the Black Europeans came as free landowners, while other Blacks were indentured slaves. Yes, it's very important to understand that while many of the first Blacks that came to the United States from Europe were indentured slaves, those people, in a sense, who were Black Indians, they were considered chattel, or they were considered property. Around AD 1310, thousands of Mandi or Mandikan speakers arrived in the Americas from ancient Mali. Mali was an ancient West African empire. Ibn Fadullah al-Umari, in his encyclopedia, Masalik al-Abshar, said the mariners from Mali during the reign of Abu Bakr made transatlantic voyages. Al-Umari obtained his information from Mansa Musa, who was handed the kingship of Mali by King Mansa Abu Bakr when he set out to colonize the Americas. Very important to understand, and don't forget that Mansa Musa was considered the richest man in history, given the fact he took so much gold with him from Mali to Egypt. The Malian people introduced their military, agricultural, and boat technology in the Americas. The Manding built dwellings depending on the topography. Near rivers, they lived on mounds. In seminary regions, they lived in cliff houses, like those found in the American Southwest. Today, the Dogon, who trace their descent to the Mandi, live in identical dwellings as those found in Colorado, where Manding inscriptions dating to AD 1000 have been found related to the Pueblo culture. Here you can see pictures of the Telem cliff dwellings in West Africa. And if you look closely, you can see that these cliff dwellings that are found in West Africa are identical to the American cliff dwellings. They show, in a sense, that continuity. This is what we call first sight consciousness. First sight consciousness is an idea developed by Dr. Marie Charles. Dr. Marie Charles has brought the fact that often when we look at civilizations in the diaspora and civilizations in Africa, we find a continuity. We find that they share many of the same features, many of the same aspects. As a result, this is what is called first sight consciousness. And first sight consciousness simply means that there's a continuity between African civilizations in Africa and Black civilizations in the diaspora. The expeditionary force of Mansa or King Abubakari must have been immense, because the average boat on the Niger in the 1500s AD could carry 80 men. Yes, 80 men. This means that anywhere between 25,000 to 80,000 men may have sailed from Mali along with Mansa Abubakari. The South Equatorial Current carried the Mali explorers to Brazil. From here, they spread throughout South Central and North America. In Mexico, the Malian wonders are depicted in the Meztec Condes Dorenberg, which is dated to the 14th century. These migrants are bearded. They have large noses and lips, just like other African people. There were many Black Native Americans when Europeans came to the United States. These Black people came to America from Africa and Asia. The first Black Native Americans to South America came from Africa around 30,000 years ago. These people proudly sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and settled in South America. These people are called the Paleo-Americans. The Paleo-Americans were Black people. The Paleo-Americans were not Mongoloid people. The Mongoloid people did not come here until 6,000 BC. That was over 24,000 years after Black people had already settled the North America, South America, and other parts of the New World. Up until 12,000 years ago, the Ice Age prevented Blacks from crossing the Bering Straits into North America. Once the ice melted, Black pygmies entered America across the straits. They were followed years later by the Mongoloid Indians. Other Blacks came to America after 1000 BC from mainland Asia by sea. These Blacks also founded settlements in places like Fiji, Micronesia, and the Melanesian Islands before they reached the United States West Coast. There were over 100 tribes in California when the Spanish arrived. The California Black Native Americans practiced many lifestyles. Some were hunter-gatherers while others fished and farmed. The Black Native Americans on the east coast of the United States mainly came from Africa. Many Black Native Americans had arrived in America before the Malians, led by King Abubakari, came to the United States after 1300. These Black Native Americans were mainly farmers. They lived on mounds near lakes and streams throughout the United States. Other Black Native Americans built the cave monuments in Four Corners regions of the United States. These tribes include the Nanticoke, the Yamasee, the Tama, the Manding, and more. Many of these Black Native American tribes were killed off by Americans during American Indian Wars. Other Black Native Americans were sold into slavery so Americans could take their land. Many states passed laws to require citizens in the states to prove their citizenship. A South Carolina slave code, for example, said that to prove you were free, you had to show documentation. As you might imagine, Black Indians were not given papers, so their land could be taken while they were sold into slavery. Sad. Also, in a sense, many people say that the word California comes from a Queen Kali who was from Africa. But in California and throughout North America, there were many Black tribes. These tribes include the Nanticoke, the Yamasee, and so many other Black tribes. You see, it is just so hard to really think about all these Indian tribes that once existed. As slaves came to the United States from Africa, many ran away to live with the Indians. In 1526, African slaves fled their Spanish masters and settled in South Carolina, Indian Territory. African slaves married many black and Mongoloid Native Americans. In 1622, at Jamestown, Virginia, the whites were killed. The African slaves settled among the black Native Americans. By 1700, many freeborn blacks on the Chesapeake Peninsula were of Native American origin. Yes, yes. There were so many slaves among the Iroquois and other northeastern American tribes that in 1726, 1764, and 1765, the governor of colonial New York exacted a promise from the Delaware, Huron, and Iroquois Indians that they would return any runaway slaves that came to their nations. But these people were B1. You see, in other words, they were black first. And when they saw these African slaves who were running away from the plantation, naturally they welcomed them into their villages, welcomed them into their forts, just as they had welcomed the Mongoloid Indians earlier. In the Indian Territory, slaves founded many maroon societies or lived on tribal lands. These runaway slaves held extensive land holdings in Florida and Nova Scotia, yes, near Halifax during the American slave period. In South Florida, 50 miles of farmland, cattle, etc. were owned by the Maroons. The blacks in Florida and Mississippi freely mixed with the Creek and Seminoles. Other Africans belonged to the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek nations. In Minnesota, by 1819, at the mouth of the St. Louis River, there were Africans living in the Ojibwa villages. Yes, yes, yes. Black people were all over the place. These Africans, because they were black, as many of the black Native Americans, they were welcomed into the tribes because these tribes were B1, black first. The black Europeans came to the United States from various European countries. These blacks include the many Negroes who had been in Europe since prehistory and other blacks that entered Europe from ancient Egypt, the Roman Empire, and during the Muslim Moorish conquest of Europe. Many of these European blacks were called gypsies in many parts of Europe. The term gypsies imply an Egyptian origin for this population. In most cases, we read about the African Muslims who ruled much of Spain and Portugal up to 1492. Although these Moors in Spain are frequently mentioned in history texts, there were many black Muslims who ruled large tracts of land in France, Germany, and Britain. Muslim teachers also dominated many institutions of higher education and began many of the first European universities. Yes, the first universities in Europe were began by African Muslims, not whites. Much of European architecture, recovery of classical literature of the Greeks and Romans, and science was done by the Muslims and Moors, these black people. David McRitchie, in his book Ancient and Modern Britons, discussed the Black Britons. The Black Britons were native to England, or they came to the British Isles from Egypt, Phoenicia, or maybe from the Roman Empire. They believe, in a sense, that the earliest person to live in Britain 22,000 years ago were black people. Yes, black people in Britain. Other black British were of Muslim and Moorish origin. These blacks dominated Scotland and Scotia, Ireland, for much of its history up until the rise of the Saxon kings. McRitchie claims that as late as the 10th century, Scotland was almost black or Negro ethnically. The descendants of the Black Britons usually have the surname Douglas, Black or Swarthy, Macduff, Dons, Browns, Black, Morian, Moore, Niger, Rorick, or Roderick. Other evidence of the Negro origin of the Black Britons was thick lips of many Britons, according to McRitchie, and the Negro Moorish coats of arms for many elite British families. Barry's Encyclopedia of Heraldica noted that Moor's head is the heraldic term for the head of a black or Negro man. Due to mixing with the invading white Europeans, the black Europeans, like the Gypsies, Scots, and Irish, lost their dark complexion. And in addition, Oliver Cromwell sent 300,000 black Irish and Scotsmen to the 13 colonies in the Caribbean. Yes, yes, Oliver Cromwell. He was a dirty man. And he killed hundreds of thousands of black people. And he was black too. This makes it a little crazy, doesn't it? Oliver Cromwell was an English general and statesman. He was born in around 1599. Cromwell was a Protestant nationalist who hated Catholics. Back in his day, the vast majority of Black British, especially in Ireland and Scotland, these blacks were mainly, in a sense, Catholics. Oliver Cromwell, he hated Catholics. He did everything in his power to destroy them, to kill them. African slaves were not the first slaves in the British Caribbean and much of the northern part of the United States. The first slaves were Aboriginal Black Native Americans and Black Irish. Yes, Black Irish. The Black Irish slaves usually had to sail to America over a 9 to 12-week period to reach the Caribbean or the 13 colonies. The trip across the Atlantic was harsh, and many Black Irishmen and Scotsmen died of scurvy, dysentery, and dehydration. To save money, the Black Irish were just tossed into the sea, just like the African slaves that came to the United States during the Middle Passage. As a member of Parliament, Oliver Cromwell became Commander-in-Chief. As Commander-in-Chief, he led armies of the Parliament of England against King Charles during the English Civil War. He also reconquered Scotland and Ireland, and subsequently ruled the British Isles as Lord Protector from 1653 until his death in 1658. An evil, dirty man. Oliver Cromwell began to reconquer Ireland in 1649. He hated Catholics. He massacred 3,500 Black Irishmen in his first battle. The rest were sold as slaves to the 13 colonies in the Caribbean. Irish slaves were sold in high numbers between 1649 to 1653. African slaves were not the first slaves in the British and Caribbean. These people, in a sense, were from Ireland. Yes, Ireland. The first Black Europeans who came to America as chattel slaves came from Britain. And Oliver Cromwell made sure to let people know that these people who were, in a sense, sent to the 13 colonies, sent to the Caribbean, would be chattel slaves and should remain as such forever. Oliver Cromwell reconquered Ireland in 1649. 100,000 Irish children were sold as slaves in Virginia and New England. Look at this picture. Here's a picture where you can see, in a sense, some of the followers of Oliver Cromwell had got the Black babies from the Irish and were talking them and spearing them. They were throwing them out into the ground, just killing them. They were hateful, very hateful people. These Protestants were hateful, you see. And then with pitchforks, they threw the children into the water. Just think about that. Think about that. Sometimes when you think about the things that Europeans can do to other people, it's unimaginable because you couldn't do it. King William III came to power through support of parliamentary opposition to King James. William was a prominent soldier that was married to the king's daughter Mary. In 1688, the parliamentary opposition invited William to take over the British crown. William landed in England in November 1688 with 463 ships and 14,000 troops. The forces of William were not opposed by the British Navy. No, because they wanted to get rid of that Black king and put a Caucasian in his place. William marched on London and King James fled to France. In February 1689, William became King William III and Queen Mary became Queen Mary II. This takes over the crown by King William was called the Glorious Revolution. Many of the Jacobites that came to the United States were marronage or blacks. Yes. If you read the literature, you're going to find that many of the Jacobites were Black people. These were Black Catholics. The Parliament passed the Bill of Rights around the time this law made it against the law for any Catholic or descendant of King James to become the King of England. King James VI of Scotland was King James III of England. His son was James Francis Edward Stuart. He was the Jacobite prince of King James III. Look, here you can see a picture of King James. Yes. They know, the English know that the first rulers, the first monarchs in Britain were not Caucasians. They were Black people. And many of these Black people who were not royal, many of these Black people who were not nobles, many of these Black people were sold as chattel slaves in the 13 colonies and the Caribbean because of the fact they were Catholic. You may ask the question, if tens of thousands of Irish and Scotsmen were Negro or Black, especially the elites, why aren't they depicted as blacks in their paintings? The answer is simple. Most of the original paintings of the marronage, that's what we should call, in a sense, the earliest black people in Britain, you know, were destroyed. You see? For example, you can look at here, we see in the middle an engraving of King James. And although you can clearly see that this picture of King James, when we look in the middle, you can see his Africanness, his Negroidness. But those aren't the pictures that you usually see. You usually either see the picture on the left or the picture on the right. And they claim that these are pictures of King James. No, they're not. They're fake. They're fake. And much of the history that we know about Britain is a fake history. John Mackay was a spy of King William III. His job was to spy on the Jacobites. John Mackay in Memoirs of the Secret Service of John Mackay, 1733, tells us about his monitoring of the Jacobites. In the memoirs, John Mackay describes the complexions of the Jacobite leaders. In his writings, Mackay makes it clear that Charles Seymour, Duke of Somerset, Sidney Godolphin, Lord Treasurer of England, Daniel Finch, Secretary of State, the Earl of Nottingham, John Hose, Duke of Newcastle, Charles Lennox, Duke of Richmond, son of King Charles II, and his brother Charles Beauclerk, Duke of St. Albans, were all described as having very black complexions, or black and ruddy, to name a few of the Jacobites. Other Jacobites were described as having a brown complexion. Yes, you have to get John Mackay's Memoirs of the Secret Service of John Mackay, 1733. In this book, it tells you, it describes all of the Jacobite leaders, and you see if they were black, but they don't teach you this in school. When they tell you how the Irish turned black, they're really talking about the fact that many of the original Irish that came over here were black. Paintings of the marronage, or blacks of Britain, were purposely destroyed by Thomas Cromwell. You can see a picture of Thomas Cromwell on the right. Thomas Cromwell, he hated Catholics and blacks generally. Selwood, 2015, wrote that against a backdrop of Henry VII's marital strife, the pathologically ambitious Cromwell single-handedly masterminded the break with Rome in order to hand Henry the church with its all-important ability to have a divorce. Flushed with the success of engineering Henry's first divorce, Cromwell moved on to confiscating the church's money. He added that with lazy strokes of his pen, he condemned royalty, nobles, peasants, nuns, and monks to horrific summary executions. Yes, yes, yes. We don't know if Thomas Cromwell was related to Oliver Cromwell, but as you can see, this man was almost as evil as him. You see, why don't we see art? Why don't we see arts of all these black people? If all these black people are black, why don't we see art? Selwood tells us in this story, in his article he wrote. And Selwood wrote in 2015, he said, and then, I quote, and then there is the impact on this country's artistic and intellectual heritage. No one can be sure of the exact figure, but it is estimated that the destruction started by Cromwell amounted to 97% of the English art then in existence. Yes, this man destroyed 97% of the English art so he could rewrite, repaint all these people who were black and make them white. I continue. Statues were hacked down. Frescoes were smashed to bits. Mosaics were pulverized. Illuminated manuscripts were shredded. Wooden carvings were burned. Precious metalwork was metaled down. Shrines were reduced to rubble. This vandalism went way beyond a religious reform. It was a frenzy, obliterating the artistic patrimony of centuries of indigenous craftsmanship with an intensity of hatred for imagery and depicting the divine that has strong and resonant parallels today. Yes, yes, this man destroyed that art. I know that if I would have told you this, you would have called me a lie. But when you have the research to show that Thomas Cromwell, he destroyed these pictures. That's why we don't find as many pictures that was made during this period of the black royals, because he destroyed them. Now you know why we have very few artifacts depicting the marronage, or the ancient Black Britons. Many of the Irish slaves were women and children sent to Barbados and the 13 colonies. 50,000 a year Black Irish slaves were sold to New World between 1652 and 1656. Scots also were sold as slaves. If they were Black and Catholic, they became a slave, a chattel slave, a chattel slave. 1652, 1656, that was even before they started bringing Africans as slaves. The British, they made those Black Scotsmen, they made those Black Irishmen their slaves. There was an estimated 200,000 Black Irish sold into slavery between 1651 and 1660. The Black Irish were replaced by whites from England who were given land to settle in Ireland. Many Blacks who live in the United States today have a direct European heritage. This class of FBA would mainly be descendants of Catholic Black Irish and Scotsmen sent to the 13 colonies between 1659 and 1660. Some descendants of free European Blacks probably went to Canada after the Revolutionary War. Those Europeans who remained in the United States, especially those who lived in New England, they married white women. And over time, in a sense, these Black people would have, in a sense, became white because they would have been just marrying white women all the time. Few Blacks of direct European heritage probably live in the United States today. These descendants of free European Blacks probably went to Canada after the Revolutionary War. Most of the Blacks that lived in New England, as I said before, are white. But we know in a sense that many of these Black people, these Black Europeans, were not destroyed. For example, in 1850, while 83 out of every 1,000 slaves was a mulatto, 581 out of every 1,000 free foundational Black Americans, or 58%, were mulattoes. Given the evident high rate of intermarriage between Blacks and whites in the North, it was only logical that as these Blacks became lighter and lighter, they would have joined the white race to avoid the racism experienced by darker-skinned Blacks. During the 1940s, they called this phenomena of light-skinned Blacks living as white Americans passing. The most obvious fallacy is that all United States Blacks were slaves. No, they weren't all slaves. Actually, about 16 to 20% of foundational Black Americans were always free. And in that group, there included Black slaveholders. This would include, in a sense, Black Europeans and Black Native Americans. As you can see in this chart, on the right-hand side, you can see the various Negroes in colonial New England. You can see the distribution of slaves, free men, and stuff like that. So you can take a minute and kind of look at it. This is the end of this video. And this is, in a sense, the foundations. Remember that the FBA population is a population that is not, in a sense, just a population that was relegated to an African origin. The foundational Black American heritage is a heritage that is a tripartite heritage, a heritage, in a sense, that comes from the fact that we are descendants of three groups: the Black Native Americans, the Black Europeans, and of course, Africans.